Okay, I think, right, we've got Sarah Ryan, which is fantastic. Now, Sarah has very, very kindly agreed to talk to us today, really giving us an introduction to sort of social care research methods to those perhaps who are less well versed in them. So I'm really very grateful to Sarah for coming along today to talk to us about this. So I'll hand over to you now, Sarah. Thank you.
Yeah, my name's Sara Ryan. I'm an associate professor at the University of Oxford. I've recently, this year, I've been fortunate enough to receive £2 million worth of NIHR social care funding. So I'm not sure who is in the room or what your level of expertise is around methods. It was pitched at a novice method session, but please feel free to stick up your hand at any point, interrupt me with any questions. And if it's too basic for you, I apologise for that. So, next slide. So thinking about research, and again, I'm not sure who is here. So this is a very basic rattle through first of all. So research is about asking and answering important questions. And some of this has been covered this morning, of course, even in the last session, that it's really important to ask questions that matter. Ask questions that are going to fill a gap, that's going to make a difference and have impact. And so once you've found the area, the gap that you want to research, then you need to think about what methods am I going to use here in order to answer the questions effectively. And there's different approaches to research, and these different approaches produce different kinds of knowledge. And it depends to a large extent on what sort of question you're asking, which route you'll go down. And these different kind of knowledges, for example, qualitative or quantitative methods, help us to understand different things. So that's the very basic research methods underpinning. So the question you'll be asking yourselves for your projects with your research question, what's the best approach to use to answer this question? Am I asking a question about how something happens or what happens? Or am I trying to understand why something happens? And you would go down a quantitative methods route. If you see the world, the social world, as objective and measurable, then you're likely to have a quantitative question, which will be asking, you'll have a hypothesis that you believe X causes Y, and you set out to test that hypothesis using quantitative methods. If you see the social world as less certain, as not measurable, but as something constructed, then you'll be more interested in why. Why does something happen? Why do people do this? Why do support workers find it very difficult to do X, Y, or Z, for example? And you'll be taking an interpretive approach and using qualitative methods. And I'm actually a qualitative researcher as opposed to a quantitative researcher. And so I'm going to be focusing more on the qualitative methods in this session. At the same time, you can obviously mix methods, and you can bring together a project design that has qualitative and quantitative methods. If you do this, you need to have a really good justification for why you're mixing the methods, and you really need to have a very careful plot through your design to demonstrate clearly why you're using a survey, for example, and what you're trying to generate from that survey data, and how the qualitative arm of your study fits with the quantitative arm, or how the quantitative arm fits with the qualitative arm. Are you going to have one main methodological approach, for example, but you're going to draw a different disciplinary approach, a different methodological approach to sort of complement your main research? Are you going to run both methodological strands alongside each other? Does one come first, followed by the other? So you need to think through all these different questions. And again, it comes down to what question you're asking, how your research design how you'll develop your research design. Now, in addition to the choices of which methods you use, there's also an enormous literature around the use of these different approaches. And so we've got these methodological considerations too around whatever approach you take, and whether or not, for example, if you're going to use an existing survey, is it the best survey to use? And so you'll be drawing on that methodological literature too to support the decisions you're making. And again, if you're going to do a qualitative study, there's this wonderful literature around criticising, sorry about my dog, critiquing the use of particular methods in qualitative research. So again, your research, when you're designing your research project, you really need to try and get on top of these methodological debates too, in order to present the most robust research design. Now, is everybody with me so far? And does anybody talk? I've never used Collaborate before.
They can pop their hands up if they want.
Okay. Cool. So stick your hands up if you want to ask a question, basically. Okay, so that's the layers that you're looking at in terms of deciding on your methods. Now, as a qualitative researcher, I'm firmly of the belief that numbers can't tell the whole story. And as a sociologist by background, I really want to understand the meaning people attach to their social worlds, really. I want to understand why people do things, how they feel about things, what propels them to do X rather than Y, you know, what's underpinning the actions people take. And so that leads me inevitably to qualitative research design. So, I keep clicking the wrong thing. So if we look at, if this is just an example to show you the different sort of approaches, what a different way of looking at the same sort of question can be, or the same focus. This is a table, a diagram from a study about the frequency of women's sleep problems when they're over 40. And so we can look at this pie chart and see quite quickly that about 3/4 of women do actually have problems sleeping. So this is, and they've got a number of 1,400 survey participants, which is quite a sort of robust number. And so we've been given this picture, you know, how often do women over 40 have problems sleeping? But we don't really know what underpins these problems. And so this is where the qualitative research comes in. And here we've got a data extract from a focus group study from European Union Sleeping and Aging Women project, which fills in some of those gaps. And there's just one data extract here about a mother saying that she's not sleeping because of her children. She's got different age children, and this is one of the reasons why she has disrupted sleep. And of course, in that study, the focus group study, then they would have probably done a number of focus groups in which women are encouraged to talk between each other around why they may have problems sleeping, and then this data is analysed. So you can see that there's very much space for these different approaches, and you need to decide whether or not your study is going to draw these together, or just answer the one question about how many, what's the frequency, or why. So if we move on now to qualitative research, and I'm sorry if there's quantitative researchers in the room who want more quants, but we could have a discussion at the end of this, hopefully, if we've got some time. So qualitative research, there's a nice quote here from Denzine and Lincoln, and I would recommend Denzine and Lincoln's Qualitative Research Handbook, which is a massive book that they've divided into 3 separate sections. That's was written 20 years ago now, but it's still a really comprehensive. The latest version is a really nice Bible for qualitative research. So their definition is on the screen here, and you can see that it's about being in the social world with the people that you're studying. It's not about sitting back at your desk having sent your survey out. It's about engaging with people. It's about working in the field to make the world visible, to sort of surface things around what's going on. And it's very naturalistic, and it's interesting, qualitative research, because part of the Silverman critique of interviews that I showed you earlier is around the fakery almost of a research and interview research setting, in which a researcher has decided that they want to ask certain questions, has got the research participant in the room with them, and is basically sort of, I mean, Silverman calls it Oprah Winfrey style approach. He's actually incredibly critical of this approach, but I think it's really important to remain mindful of the methods you're using and how to make them as robust as possible. So the gold standard for qualitative research would be ethnography, which is where you actually go and hang out with people over a period of time and really get to understand what's going on. That's not always practical, and another feature in your research designs has got to be pragmatic considerations around time, money. You know, the research funding will have a ceiling on it. What can you do to answer your research question within the budget that is on offer? So you need to think about all these different things. And one of the strengths of qualitative research is the flexibility it offers in that you can tweak methods. You don't have to take the interview handbook, for example, and just follow the steps in that. If your particular research focus is around an area that interviews don't quite sit, you sort of think, I don't think interviews, a face-to-face interview isn't going to sort of sit well with this group of people. Think of other ways of doing it. Think about using email, for example. Think about whether you want to do Twitter chats. Think about whether you want to sort of engage with your participants in alternative ways and creative ways. And there's a lovely book that's written around vulnerable participants, it's called, and how to involve people who may have had quite extreme experiences, and some really nice methods there around walking interviews, for example. Or there was a father in one of the studies who'd experienced bereavement, and the researcher gave him, he just couldn't talk about his experiences in an interview setting. It was too painful for him. So the researcher gave him a camera. He was a farmer, and he'd take the camera when he was sort of dealing with the cows and just sort of record his feelings then. So it's about really trying to fit into people's worlds as opposed to trying to make them fit into your world. And the bottom line is always you're trying to understand the meaning people have to their actions. And one of the key things around that is you have to always remain mindful of what your feelings are around these things too. And I'll come back to that in a second. So, some basics here, key features of interviews: naturalistic, as I said, not like a laboratory experiment or a survey. You're looking for meaning rather than cause. Sampling is a really interesting issue in qualitative research. And again, I really recommend you look at the sampling literature around how many, because that's a key consideration, because there is quite a push because people are less aware of qualitative research and what underpins it and try to use a quantitative lens to judge it. So we're always going for bigger sample, the bigger the better. But in actual fact, there is research published. Philip Guest, for example, in the Field Journal, went back and reanalyzed. He did 60 interviews for a project. And he went back later and reanalyzed his interviews in a much more robust and comprehensive way, and found that he'd actually reached data saturation, which is when you stop hearing new things when you're interviewing people, or if you're in the field doing an ethnography, you're hearing the same things, and the categories of data you've already generated are robust enough to answer your question. And Philip Guest found out of the 60 interviews, I think it was number 8, he'd reached data saturation. And there's ethical considerations around that as well, in terms of wasting people's time, burdening people if you're going for more. You know, if people say, oh, I'll do an interview study, I'm going to interview 50 people, you need to think, why are you saying 50? What's, where did you get that number from? And make sure it's clear in your research design that you will be paying attention to when you reach data saturation in the analysis process that goes alongside the field work, so that you are very mindful of when you're beginning to hear the same sort of stories again, that you're not hearing anything new. So again, that's another consideration that really demands you should look at the literature in this area. Key features 2, explicit and systematic. Having said that it's flexible, it doesn't mean to say it's like a flaky, anecdotal, oh, let's do this today sort of process. It's really not. You have to completely transparently explain why you've done what you've done, why you've chosen these methods, why you're doing it this way. And within your research, when you're funded and you're doing the research, you really need to build in sort of checks and balances almost with second researchers, always sharing your interview schedule or sharing your first few interviews with a colleague or a supervisor. So you're always getting feedback on what you're doing. That's really, really important. Now, obviously, it's different methods of qualitative research, and these can include, as I've mentioned, interviews, group interviews or focus groups, observations, all sorts of different qualitative methods. That your role as a researcher is very different within a qualitative study, not completely different, because quantitative researchers should also remain reflective, but you really need to examine your own experiences, your own assumptions, your own, that I would be a white middle class researcher, for example. If I'm going to go out in the field and interview people with a completely different background to me, I really need to be looking at what I'm basing my assumptions on and try to deal with that. And one example of that is when I did my PhD research, I was interviewing parents of children, autistic children, And one mother said to me, and it was about going out in everyday life in public places. And one woman said to me, oh, I always take my son, who's autistic, to Tesco's at 8 o'clock on a Saturday morning to do the shopping. And I sort of thought, oh, that makes perfect sense to me. And then towards the end of the interview, I sort of thought, I'm assuming I know why she's taking her son at 8 o'clock in the morning. But I asked her, I said, could you tell me why? And instead of saying, well, it's because the shop's quiet and it's less disruptive for everybody and it's just easier, she said that he liked to touch people's arms and say hello. And if the shop was busy, people were less likely to say hello to him. And that was quite a sort of revelatory moment for me, because I sort of started to think, gosh, how often have I made assumptions in doing research that I know what somebody's said or why they've said it, and haven't asked them to explain why. So, and a key part of reflexivity for me is to always get people to explain why they've said what they've said and what they mean by it. If they say, oh, I felt really stigmatized because I was smoking, I'm still a smoker, then always say to people, when you say you feel stigmatized, what do you mean by that? And so that's an example of reflexivity, and research is always trying to sort of self-check your position, really. I've already mentioned the flexibility in qualitative research, and the projects I've got at the moment, we have a protocol, we know what we're doing, but at certain points we will as a group, as a research team, sort of think, actually, I think this isn't working, or what we need to do is X or Y. Or if you're doing your analysis, suddenly something crops up in interview 23 and you think, oh my goodness, we've not had this in the data yet, but you need to go back and reread all the earlier interviews. So very much qualitative research is very much a flexible, iterative process. And your analysis is inductive. That is, it's coming from the bottom up. And this ties into the shopping question in my PhD, that the data is leading you. You're not leading the data as you would be in a quantitative study. So, good quality research, small numbers of participants. There's no statistical power or any sort of generalization. You want your research findings to be relevant and useful beyond your immediate research setting, but you're not looking for statistical representation at all. You do need to be experienced, and if you're not experienced researchers among you, then I really recommend that you go on training courses and you pilot everything, and you really immerse yourself in the methodological literature. You try things out when you're with your friends or whatever. Just try to sort of practice. I think it is practice, really, and then gaining the experience as you go along. And if you don't have the experience, you really need to get yourself some very experienced allies around you to help you and enable you to develop those skills really well and really robustly. There's a list here of poor quality research. If you're questioning this, poor quality research shouldn't really make it through the review process, to be honest, but every so often it does. If that you're just doing it, you're undertaking this research for the wrong reasons. The aims just aren't robust enough, that the study doesn't quite work. I think the research processes are so robust these days that this is less likely to get funding. Your sampling strategy is inadequate. Always a difficult one. If you're thinking about your research population as you're writing your research bid, you have to engage with the people from that population and try to anticipate any problems you might face in advance so that you can iron these out in your research design. It's very, very difficult once you're doing a project if you suddenly find that it's almost impossible to recruit people to answer your question for various reasons that are a problem from way back when you were planning the study. Poor quality research is descriptive. I mean, it's not a descriptive process. You're right, you will have descriptive outputs, but the description is based for a lay audience to engage with people, but your findings are analytical. You need to have really analytically robust findings. Lack of rigor in analysis. Again, go on a course, always do an analysis course. Read the books, read the literature. It's something that really needs to be meticulously done. There's some terribly poor examples of qualitative research in the BMJ, for example. Appalling examples of research where you just get a sort of set of assertions and then just some quotes that have just been dropped in. which really are upsetting because it's clear that the journal reviewers are using a checklist for qualitative research. The author is just literally going through the checklist and saying, we reach data saturation, full stop. Here's a couple of quotes, full stop. And very, very insubstantial research that does get circulated in fields where qualitative research is not well regarded. And you need to always present your results with a contextual background. You've identified the gap that you want to study, you've gone out, you've done your study really well, you've produced findings, that you don't just take those findings away from the context in which they were, generated in the first place. So a quick mention of a health website that we publish a lot of our research on in the department I'm in, which is Healthtalkorg, which is a wonderful resource. It's got over 100 projects of qualitative interview projects where researchers have gone all over the country, interviewed and filmed people about different experiences, and produced lay summaries on the website with interview extracts that are filmed. And just one example of a project here is women's experiences of domestic violence and abuse, which includes about 40 women's experiences of different aspects. And down the side there you can see it's divided into different sections like coercive, controlling behaviour, physical violence and impacts on women's health, and so on. Now, one of the exciting things about this website is we're currently producing a social care version. So some of you thinking about outputs for your projects could get in touch with the DIPEX charity, which host both these sites, to talk about whether you could have this website as a dissemination route, the social care website. The other point of showing you this website is that it's a really useful PPI tool, because you can look at people's experiences of X, Y, and Z, which may be relevant to your project. And it's like a form of public engagement, is to hear people's experiences. So it's like a shortcut PPI tool there. So key characteristics of a qualitative researcher: curious, listening is so important, engagement I'm going to come back to because that is the key point. A good researcher is flexible and, as I've said, reflexive. Keep a research diary, write down everything, always thinking about what you're doing and why you're doing it. So a quick little wazzle through engagement, which builds on the PPI talk you've just had. To me, one of my key research endeavours, missions at the moment is why is our research so selective? Why do we not involve certain people in research so often? And why is this a problem? Now, when I came to work in the department and I started doing health talk projects, I soon found that whilst they had over 100 projects online about cancer, giving birth, so many different health conditions, menopause, not one single study had a person with a learning disability in it. And this was really problematic and eye-opening to me, because it was sort of just showed that the maximum diverse sampling approach that the researchers were supposedly taking was excluding particular people. So why is this a problem? It's a problem because, I'll come back to that. I'm going to first of all answer why some people are seldom heard. I think the issue with I think the key issue is that people are prejudiced, really, and they exclude certain people's experiences from looking at a sample they wouldn't even dream of including, say, somebody with a learning disability or an asylum seeker with breast cancer, for example. So I think we certain identities conceal the fact that people are people, and they have the same health issues. Everybody has the same health issues as each other, really. So we need to be very mindful of that. There's a lack of thought or interest in these groups quite often. They're not conceived as valid participants. It can be perceived as too hard. There can be an element of fear around including certain people. It can be seen as too time consuming. It can be seen, people don't understand, researchers don't understand the importance of listening to particular people. And this comes back to the question of why is this a problem? So it's a problem because the people at the margins of society have the best view of the centre of society, because they're forced to, because if you're in the middle and you're bubbling along in quite a very comfortable, privileged way, you don't see the experiences that people are having around the edge, because why would you? On the other hand, the people at the edges have a very, very clear view of the group in the middle, and they have a very, very strong understanding of their own situation and what's going on. And so our research is immeasurably enhanced if we always make sure we try to include people at the edges. Now I realise I'm not showing a slideshow here, but I've got a lovely quote here, and I think that Brian's giving you all the slides anyway, so you don't need to puzzle over it too much right now. But this is a quote from Hannah Arendt, which I think is a really important sort of statement to underpin our research endeavours. And what she's saying is that we have to be able to make distance what is very familiar to us. So we have to sort of try to make our own experiences strange in order to better understand the assumptions that we have, that we just live with every day. And then we have to understand that which is so far away as if it was our own affair. So what she's basically saying is you want to sort of problematize your own experiences, but then at the same time make sure you're understanding the experiences around the edges in a way that makes them important to us, as important as our own issues are. So I do like that quote. And then I'm just going to finish here with a set of tips, concluding thoughts. Source relevant training is essential. Immerse yourself in the field you want to study. The PPI thing, I would say, building on the PPI thing, don't think of PPI as a set of people you're just going to talk with. You need to sort of really talk to lots of people and really read books, read fiction, read newspaper reports. Just immerse yourself in the field you want to study. Engage, as we heard before, engage. Be creative and, like I say, fit into people's worlds. Keep your diary. Think about the impact of your study, and the most important thing, and this sometimes keeps me awake at night with my projects, is ask yourself, so what? So, thank you.